Now, the English were effectively at war pretty much constantly throughout this period. Now, this was both official wars, where the English were officially at war with another country, or also times when there was a Cold War, when they were at war but there was no fighting, or lastly, when English troops were fighting abroad for other armies or other countries. So there were wars at home, fighting rebellions, invaders, or the Scots, and effectively the English Civil War was the major one in this period. But also wars overseas, fightings in countries like France, Germany, the Netherlands, Portugal or Spain, either as an English army or as mercenaries fighting abroad. Now, the way these wars affected people depended on the three distinct periods and the recruitment that was used in those times. So from 1500 to 1642, the king and the country relied on the Tudor methods and the Tudor systems that had existed for a period of time. 1642 to 60, the English Civil Wars in the English Republic saw big changes in how people recruited. And then lastly, 1660 to 99, there was a restoration and war abroad and new methods for these. Recruitment in the Tudor period, roughly 1500 to 1642. Now, after the Wars of the Roses ended in 1485, the Tudors wanted to break the dominance of the great nobles, effectively because in the Wars of the Roses, the two big families had used their armies to fight against each other, undermining the power of whoever was king. Now, the Tudors realised that to truly control the country, they had to undermine the power of these great nobles and make sure they could raise an army themselves. So they decided to go back to a militia system, which was outlined in the Statute of Winchester back in 1285, something we looked at earlier. Now, under this, all men from 16 to 60 were supposed to serve for the king. They had to provide their own weapons depending on their wealth, ranging from a simple club or a longbow all the way up to a full suit of armour and horses. Each country had general musters, where all men turned up to show their weapons and armour every couple of years, and the idea was that they did some training and they were checked up on at this time. If you did not attend or had the wrong weapons, you could be fined. The militia were run by Lord Lieutenants who were appointed by the monarch. Now, often these were nobles, but because they were appointed by the monarch, they exerted a certain amount of control over them. And the militia in theory could not be made to serve outside their county unless there was an invasion, though they often bypassed this rule. For overseas battles, the monarch simply told the Lord Lieutenant how many were needed, and they were pressed, which means forced, into fighting and going abroad to fight for the king. They should have been volunteers, but effectively they were often forced to do this. With the general muster only being once every 2 years, the Tudors soon realised they needed to try and train some of their troops better for warfare. So they set up trained bands in 1573 to meet up once a month to train in each county, and effectively a group of the militia would meet up and would try and become better trained than the others so they could lead and be a more efficient fighting force. From the 1580s, this became more important due to the danger of Spanish invasion, so the government sent out professional soldiers called muster masters to work with these trained bands and to try and make them as effective as possible. However, the local nobility did not like taking orders from these lower class professional soldiers and soon demanded that they took on the roles of muster masters. So as these professional soldiers were replaced by nobility, unfortunately the training got worse as they were not professional soldiers and did not have the same expertise as the original muster masters, becoming so much more important. Now, this is largely because training the troops in these large armies to fight together was very difficult at this time, particularly with the invention of more complicated weaponry. And as you can see here, the stages of loading and firing a musket were very complicated and took a fair amount of training to get people efficiently using the musket. Now also, musketeers were trained to fight in 6 rows. The first row would fire, then the second row would walk between them, fire, then the third, fourth, fifth and sixth. So much so that actually they could all fire almost continuously. Now this obviously took a lot of training, and the gap between the rows allowed them to reload, creating this continuous fire. Now this was complicated enough, but then they also had to train musketeers to fight with pikemen to defend them in a form of schildtron in case they were attacked by cavalry or other groups. So clearly training was important to make this militia efficient and effective. So how well did this training work? The system worked well for defending the country in the 16th century. However, the trained bands were often drunks and the training not very good. So this idea of having trained bands to have more professional soldiers actually did not have much impact and did not benefit the army a great deal. Wars overseas were less successful than when they defended the country. Only 10% of the 12,000 men sent to fight in Germany were alive a year later. So effectively, if Scotland or someone invaded, the militia was a relatively effective defensive force, but when sent abroad, it was nowhere near as effective. Now this is partly because the soldiers who were sent overseas were normally unemployed or criminals, as most people paid bribes not to go, and the monarch could not really force them. However, in 1639 and 1640, two disastrous wars in Scotland showed the system had to change, putting great pressure on King Charles I. Now the problems of these methods really came to the fore in the English civil wars. At first, both armies relied mostly on amateur soldiers. There were some professional soldiers who had fought in Europe who returned to fight in the Civil War, and they tried to use drill books and some standard practice. However, the nobility and gentry still felt that they should be commanding the armies, and they undermined the work of these professional soldiers. The troops that were used refused to serve away from home, their pay was often late, and both sides took free quarter, which meant supplies from local people without paying. And both sides had pressed into service many of their soldiers, and due to this, many simply deserted. Therefore, the Civil War showed that these amateur soldiers had major problems and were not that effective in many ways. Parliament, in the winter of 1644-5, decided to raise a national army, a decision which ultimately would win the Civil War for them, and this was known as the New Model Army. Now, a key point of this army was that they regularly gave command to soldiers, not politicians, and not the nobility or gentry. So Oliver Cromwell was the main supporter in Parliament and became a key general for the army, and it was led by Sir Thomas Fairfax as its leader, who was a soldier rather than a member of the landed gentry. It consisted of 6,600 cavalry raised from existing armies. Now this was the creme de la creme, the best part of the army. They were well trained and paid well at 24 pence a day. They were able to charge, defeat the enemy and remained under control, so they could be used to complete victory in a battle. They also had dragoons, the mounted musketeers. There's 1,000 of them raised from existing forces, and the infantry. Now the infantry was less successful than the cavalry and the dragoons. There was roughly 14,400, with over 7,000 being pressed men. They were poorly paid at 8p a day, and desertion was a massive problem. Actually, they were constantly having to press new soldiers as so many were deserting. And this new model army defeated Charles I at Naseby, winning the Civil War, partly because Fairfax, as its leader, wanted successful soldiers as his officers, irrespective of social class. These were controversial requests, but led to a lot more efficient army. The army led to the development of a standing army. A standing army is a full-time professional army which exists permanently to protect the country. This is a big benefit for a country because war was becoming more complicated and depended on well-trained troops, and the old way of having a militia which met up once every couple of years to check on weaponry was no longer good enough to provide an army. And standing armies made the state, and therefore the leader of the country, more powerful. Now this was part of the problem. Parliament had resisted a standing army as they felt it would make the king too powerful, and they saw across Europe where kings did have standing armies, the king dominating the country and taking over. They also had worried it would be too expensive. Parliament was in charge of taxation, and they did not want to raise taxes to pay for this standing army, which obviously would be very expensive. Now the problem was, in 1639 and 1640, the Scots had ended up invading the north of England, and the local militia had not been strong enough to stop them, showing that maybe they needed a standing army. However, they didn't trust King Charles I, and actually part of the Civil War was an argument over whether he should have a standing army or not. So it is ironic in a way that Parliament ended up creating a standing army, exactly what Charles had wanted, and part of the reason they were fighting a civil war, to defeat Charles I. Now, ironically as well, the New Model Army was a standing army, and so did need higher taxes, and they did interfere in politics and had an influence on who was in charge of the country. However, because Parliament was so anti having a standing army, they refused to admit it was one for another 100 years or so. So effectively, England had a standing army, but never really admitted to it or passed any laws to protect it for another 100 years after it was set up. Is the impact of war on civilians, and this effectively breaks down to before the Civil War and during and then after the Civil War. Now, before the Civil War, recruited soldiers for wars overseas were taken off to fight. If they survived, they were brought back and they were demobilised, which means released from the army after war at the port they set sail from, even if their home was a long way away. So they then had to walk home begging for shelter and food, and often found their jobs were taken when they got home. So this, even the wars overseas, had quite a large impact because people would be losing their jobs, but also having these homeless soldiers come back who then had to walk the streets to try and find food and lodgings to get home, had quite a large impact on the areas that they came back to. Home militias, however, were a lot less strenuous, and people tend to enjoy the muster days, so that was less of a problem for the people of England. Now, another part that had an impact was requisitioning, which was demanding goods and services, and it was an essential part of war, with armies taking goods as wide-ranging as boats, 2 shoes, but also boots as well. This could also take horses, war supplies, and could create shortages in the country. Taxes also went up in time of war to pay for the troops and pay for damage to society, and trade slowed as people were spending less money and there was less people to buy things. So meaning overall it was bad for the economy and people had less money. However, there was not much damage to the country in an overseas war. It was largely only along the border with Scotland and some coastal towns that were invaded, so it didn't impact on the majority of people in England. During the Civil Wars, the impact of war on civilians became a lot more extreme. Now, largely this was because the fighting was in England itself, so the damage and the impact was seen all around. In terms of recruitment, men either volunteered to fight for one of the sides or were pressed into service, sometimes for a few weeks, but often for longer, until the New Model Army created professional soldiers for the Parliament side. Requisitioning was widespread. There was ships and military supplies, but also men plundered from their enemies and demanded free quarter, sometimes leaving a signed receipt that was never paid. Free quarter, this was the idea that they would turn up, use your house, eat your food, and then leave a receipt that should have been paid for, but was very rarely done so. Plunder was partly because there was a shortage of supplies and no money to pay the soldiers, so they would go and take things, but sometimes actually they did it to punish people who supported the other side, or just rewards to the soldiers that they could take what they wanted from the defeated towns and cities. Taxes became huge to pay for the war. Oxfordshire collected £3,500 per year before the war and around £60,000 per year during the war to pay to the king to help fund the war. Now, damage to crops and farms was widespread, but so was the damage caused by sieges. Around 11,000 houses were destroyed and 55,000 people made homeless during the civil wars. Many surviving castles were partially destroyed to make them useless for defence. Tudors had tried to introduce local militias to improve recruitment and to break the influence of the nobles on the king and the army. General musters and trained bands were supposed to improve training, but still the people were not well trained and many men had to be pressed into fighting. Training became more important with more complex weaponry and tactics, particularly the use of the musket and the fighting in rows, and then also the complication of having pikemen interspersed with the musketeers. Militias were trained well enough to defend, but troops sent overseas were often slaughtered, partly to do with the quality of the people who went overseas. The first standing army in England, the New Model Army, was a key reason for Parliament's success in the Civil War. Wars before the Civil War had an impact on the soldiers who fought and had an impact on taxes and living standards, but generally the people of England did not see huge differences. However, during the Civil War, the impact was widespread, with men being pressed and the damages to people's crops and livelihoods being large.